The wind had settled overnight. When I stepped outside that morning, the hills were quiet in a way they hadn't been for several days. The sky stretched wide and pale above us, and the early sunlight was just beginning to warm the rocky ground. We had camped in a shallow valley where a few scattered trees leaned against the wind that usually swept across these ridges. The grass was thinner here now, and the earth showed through in long patches of dusty brown. The road south was becoming rougher. I could see David sitting a short distance away on a flat stone, his Bible open across his knees. Pearl lay beside him with her head resting on his paws. Agnes had discovered something fascinating under a nearby rock and was digging with great enthusiasm. Claire watched her with quiet amusement. Agnes, she said calmly, if that rock moves, we may all regret it. Agnes paused for exactly 2 seconds before continuing her excavation. I walked over and sat beside David. Morning. Morning. He nodded toward the ridge to the south. We'll climb that today. I followed his gaze. The ridge looked steeper than the ones we had crossed earlier in the week, and the path that wound up its face was narrow and pale against the stone. I looked at my walker, wondering how I would make it. Sean walked up behind us and squinted at the hill. That, he said slowly, looks like a personal attack. You're going to need help, he said to me. Liam appeared a moment later and looked as well. Looks like exercise. Sean gave him a look. Mom and Dad were already moving around the fire pit, pouring tea into the tin cups we had been using all week. Dad handed one to Mom with a small smile. Mom took it gratefully. You're a good man, Harriman. He shrugged modestly. 62 years of practice. Lucia sat nearby with her notebook open, sketching the morning light as it stretched across the valley floor. Francis and Father Maximilian Colby had already begun walking slowly along the edge of the camp, talking quietly. The desert father sat on a low stone, watching the sky. There was something peaceful about the movement. We had walked long enough together now that the morning rhythm of the group had begun to settle into something natural. Boots were laced, bread was passed around, packs were lifted, Pearl stretched and shook herself awake. Agnes finally gave up on the rock and bounded through the grass with renewed energy. Within half an hour, we were moving again. The path began climbing almost immediately. It wound upward through scattered rocks and low shrubs that clung stubbornly to the hillside. The air grew warmer as the sun climbed behind us, and the valley slowly fell away below. Sean was breathing heavily within the first 10 minutes. I'm convinced, he said between steps, that someone invented hills purely to test human character. Francis glanced back at him with a smile. Then the hills are succeeding. Liam laughed. Lucia walked quietly beside Claire, occasionally pausing to examine a flower or sketch a particularly interesting rock formation before hurrying to catch up again. Colby moved easily along the path, his habit brushing softly against the dry grass. For a while we walked in silence, the rhythm of boots against stone carrying us steadily upward. I struggled to keep up with the group. About halfway up the ridge, the wind returned. It swept across the hillside in strong gusts that tugged at our clothing and carried the faint smell of distant rain somewhere far beyond the horizon. When we reached the top, Francis stopped. The land beyond the ridge stretched wide and open, a long sweep of rolling hills and pale valleys fading into the distance. But that wasn't what caught our attention. There was someone standing on the path ahead of us. He had clearly been walking toward us from the opposite direction. He looked younger than most of the people we had met along the road so far, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s. His hair moved wildly in the wind, and he carried a small backpack slung casually over one shoulder. He looked a little surprised to see such a large group crest the ridge all at once. Then he smiled in recognition. Well, he said, I was wondering when I'd run into you all. Sean looked at him. You were? Yeah. Who are you? The man shifted his pack and extended a hand. Charlie. Several people exchanged glances. Francis stepped forward first. Welcome, Charlie. Charlie shook his hand. I've heard a lot about this pilgrimage. Lucia tilted her head. You have? Charlie nodded. He winked at Francis. Then his eyes landed on Father Colby. For a brief moment, he froze. Wait, he said slowly. Colby smiled. Yes. Charlie blinked. Okay, I'm gonna need a minute with that one. Sean laughed. Join the club. We began walking again, the path now descending gently into the hills beyond the ridge. Charlie fell into step beside Francis and Colby while the rest of us spread out along the trail. After a few minutes, Sean asked the obvious question. So what brings you out here? Charlie shrugged. I spend most of my time talking to people about ideas, culture, the direction things are going. Sean nodded. That sounds exhausting. Charlie laughed. Sometimes. But the thing that fascinates me most is courage. Francis glanced at him. In what sense? Charlie kicked a small stone off the path. You'd be amazed how many people privately believe something but refuse to say it out loud. Lucia frowned. Why? Charlie answered without hesitation. Fear. Fear of losing friends, fear of losing reputation, fear of being attacked or misunderstood. He looked around the group. So they stay quiet. The wind moved through the grass again. And silence spreads, he continued. When people don't hear anyone speaking honestly, they start to assume they're alone. Dad had been listening quietly. That reminds me of something, he said. Charlie looked at him. What? Dad smiled. Courage spreads too. Charlie pointed at him. Yes, exactly. When one person finally says what everyone else is afraid to say, suddenly a lot of other people find their backbone. Colby had been listening quietly. Finally, he spoke. Yes, he said softly, but courage must also be guided by love. Charlie nodded immediately. That's true. Otherwise, it turns into something ugly. Colby continued walking for a moment before adding, History is full of people who believed they were courageous while they were actually being cruel. Charlie looked at him thoughtfully. That's fair. But the opposite danger exists too. Colby looked at him. Yes. Silence, Charlie said. Silence when truth is inconvenient. We walked a little farther before Aoife spoke up. I'll be honest, she said. I'm not sure I agree with you on some things. Charlie nodded easily. That's fine. She looked slightly surprised. You're not offended? Charlie laughed. If people only talk to those who already agree with them, conversations don't go very far. She thought for a moment. My concern is this, she said. Sometimes people who speak very boldly about truth end up creating division everywhere they go. That can damage community. Charlie nodded slowly. That's a real danger. But let me ask you something. He glanced at Francis. Is division always the worst outcome? Francis raised an eyebrow slightly. What do you think? Charlie answered carefully. Sometimes division simply reveals what was already there. Colby added quietly. And sometimes truth forces a choice. The group walked in silence for a moment. Ethan nodded slowly. That's fair. Charlie smiled slightly. But here's the thing, he said. Political courage matters, but Christian courage goes deeper. That caught everyone's attention. In politics, he continued, you might lose influence or reputation, but in the Christian life, the stakes can be much higher. Colby looked ahead across the hills. Yes, he said quietly, sometimes everything. The road curved around a small hill, opening into a wide stretch of grass that swayed gently in the afternoon wind. Pearl trotted ahead with renewed energy. Agnes darted through the grass beside her, occasionally leaping straight into the air for no apparent reason. Sean pointed. That animal runs entirely on chaos. Claire smiled faintly. Perhaps courage as well. Lucia watched Charlie for a moment, then listened to me. He talks like someone who's already fought a dragon. Clara overheard and smiled. Francis slowed slightly, so the group gathered closer again. Charlie looked thoughtful. Finally, he said quietly, You know what's interesting? What? Liam asked. The bravest Christians I've ever met aren't always the loudest ones. Francis nodded. Yes. Charlie continued. Some of them are just faithful, quietly faithful. Colby looked out across the hills. God often prepares the soul for courage long before the moment arrives. Francis turned toward the group. Courage is not only speaking boldly. He paused. Sometimes courage is remaining faithful when no one sees you at all. The wind moved across the hills again. Francis glanced briefly toward Charlie. Sometimes, he said quietly, God allows us to keep a scar, not as a mark of defeat, but as a reminder that courage has already been asked of us once before. The wind moved softly across the hillside. Charlie didn't answer immediately, but he nodded. The road stretched south before us, winding through the wide valleys toward the places we had not yet seen. And as we continued walking, the quiet strength of that truth settled into our hearts like a steady flame. Not ashamed, not silent, and not alone on the road ahead.